can combat inequality. We are not helpless. We can do something about the high and rising levels of inequality in American society. And fourth, that we need research to help identify those programs, policies, and practices that will contribute to the reduction of inequality. So, levels of inequality are exceptionally high. Inequality is all over the headlines these days. You know, we made the decision in the fall of 2013 to launch Reducing Inequality as our new focus, and I told my Board of Trustees, inequality is the fundamental challenge of our time. Not 2 months later, President Obama made a speech, and he said, inequality is the defining challenge of our time. So he and I think alike. Obama turns attention to income inequality. Inequality is stubborn. Inequality threatens the world order. Americans grapple with income inequality. Inequality is damaging the U.S. economy. It's all over the headlines these days. And that is the case because it has expanded dramatically. Now, there are many ways to demonstrate the high level of income inequality, and I'm going to use two. I'm going to show you income inequality, I'm going to show you inequality compared to the U.S. in its own historical past, and I'll show you inequality compared to other countries in the world. In both cases, inequality in the U.S. is excessive. So here's my favorite chart for showing the high level of inequality now as compared to the past in the U.S. And this comes from the work of Thomas Piketty. It originally appeared in a 2009 paper, which he co-authored with Emmanuel Saez, but you'll find it if you read Capital in the 21st Century, Piketty's widely cited new book. And what this chart shows is the percentage of income obtained by the top 10% of the income distribution in the United States. Now, what would this look like if income were equally distributed? What would this look like? Well, if income were equally distributed, then the top 10% would get 10% of the income. That's not what you see here. Going back to the early part of the 20th century, you can see that the top 10% gained between 30 and 50% of the income. So there's a very high degree of inequality in the United States. But then we went through what some writers have called the Great Compression, a contraction in the degree of inequality, as inequality plummeted through the 1940s and remained low all the way until about 1980. And since 1980, we've entered into a period known as the Great Divergence, as inequality has once again expanded. So here we have a rise in inequality that continues ceaselessly until our own time. So for a period of 35 years, we've had rising inequality in the United States. Now, you'll notice that there are two lines here. The line with the circles is based on earned income, not counting capital gains, not counting wealth that accumulates based on capital that people own. For most of this time period, the earned income and the triangles showing earned plus unearned income run along pretty well in parallel. But what's happened in the most recent time period? They've diverged. So income inequality, excluding capital gains, has increased. But inequality, including capital gains, has increased even more. So wealth, ownership, has contributed to rising income even more now than in the past, such that the top 10% of the population now earns about 50% of the income in the United States. So inequality is excessive compared to our own past. Moreover, inequality has expanded dramatically. Not only that, the effects of inequality in this generation on the outcomes of the next generation have increased. And there's a researcher named Sean Reardon who has shown that the achievement gap, the test score gap, between children from the 10th and the 90th percentiles of family income is even greater than the achievement gap between whites and African Americans, which is historically a terrible dimension of inequality in the United States. Compared to other countries, U.S. performance in education is often described as mediocre. We're in the middle. We're supposed to think of ourselves as the greatest country on earth, but our achievement lags far behind the high-achieving countries. But this diagnosis, in my opinion, misses the real story. The real story is not about the mediocre average performance in the U.S. It's about the high degree of inequality in the U.S. on the basis of geography, on the basis of ethnicity, and on the basis of economic differences. So, to give you an example, I've taken a set of test scores from the Trends in Mathematics and Science study. It's an international assessment of mathematics performance administered to children in 4th and 8th grade, approximately every 4 years. This is from the 2011 assessment of 4th grade mathematics. And you'll see the U.S., as usual, around the middle of the pack. Incidentally, there's the Czech Republic, in the same neighborhood as the U.S., slightly lower. Now, these are not all the countries in TIMSS. If I put up all the countries, you wouldn't be able to read the chart. So I just selected a few, but the relative positions are about right. So the U.S. is around in the top third, let's say, maybe the 40th percentile, around the middle of the pack. Not as high as the highest achieving countries, Singapore, Japan, Taiwan, so not near the top of the distribution. But the blue line here represents school districts that are relatively affluent, with fewer than 25% of children receiving free and reduced price lunch. And the average test scores in these districts is very high, and as high, in fact, as the highest achieving countries in the world. By contrast, the purple line represents school districts with a high percentage of students on free and reduced price lunch, about 90% on free and reduced price lunch. And these are among the poorest school districts in the United States. And here, achievement is much lower, not at the bottom of the distribution, not as low as Chile or Spain or other African or South American nations, but well below the U.S. average, below the Czech Republic, below other Western nations. So that the real story here is not that the U.S. is in the middle of the distribution, but that there are wide gaps in school districts with different types of populations. Here is 8th grade mathematics. And I'm showing you 8th grade mathematics because for the 8th grade math test in 2011, several states agreed to participate with representative samples of the state populations. And here we see a similar story as I was showing you a moment ago for rich and poor districts. I give you the example of Massachusetts and Alabama. So test scores in Massachusetts are like those in the highest performing countries. Test scores in Alabama, well, they're not the lowest, they're not comparable to the lowest performing countries in the world, but they would be among the lower performing Western nations. So again, by geography, we see substantial inequality in educational performance in the United States. Now, this is a headline from a recent New York Times article. Once a leader, the U.S. lags in college degrees. The U.S. was once first in the world in the percentage of people receiving college degrees, and now the U.S. is 14th. But this mediocre average obscures a high degree of inequality. For example, in Massachusetts, 54% of young people go on to earn college degrees, whereas in Arkansas, 29% earn college degrees. Massachusetts would be first in the world if it were a country. Arkansas would be 28th. And there are also large gaps by socioeconomic status and race and ethnicity. Incidentally, the Czech Republic also has a relatively low rate of earning college degrees. 23%. It's 31st in the world, according to the same study. And my understanding from the research of Professor Mateu and others is that the unitary system of higher education in the Czech Republic has put constraints on the expansion of higher education here. And we can see the reflection of this in these international results. A couple more examples of excessive inequality in the United States with a comparison to the Czech Republic. This is from a study of adult literacy from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD. The finding is that average or below average performance in the US obscures the fact that we have the highest level of inequality in the world. Okay, don't worry if you can't read this. I'm going to blow it up bigger in a second. I just put it like this so you could get the big picture. So this is a graph with the different levels of inequality. That's the relation between family background and level of literacy as an adult, going from low on the bottom to high at the top. And then on the top is the span of literacy from low on the left to high on the right. So that's the big picture. And there's the United States with below average performance and the most inequality of any country. There's the Czech Republic with average performance and average inequality. So compared to the US, performance is higher and inequality is lower. So there it is, a little big, hopefully big enough to read. You can see the United States at the very top of all countries when it comes to inequality, and below the middle when it comes to performance. The Czech Republic to the right and lower down in the inequality realm. So the US has below average performance and high inequality, and another indicator from the same study looked at the likelihood of having high levels of literacy depending on your education and your parents' education. And this study showed that in the United States, a high school dropout whose parents were also high school dropouts was 10 times more likely to have low level of literacy than a student who graduated from high school and whose parents also graduated from high school. So a huge gap in levels of literacy between highly educated people from high education families compared to low education from low education families. And this gap was twice the size of the international average. So whether our gaze is international or historical, inequality in the United States is exceptionally high. Moreover, inequality is getting worse. It's not getting better. If we put a spotlight on education, the gateway to mobility, the trends towards greater inequality is vivid. For example, black-white inequality, inequality between African Americans and whites in the United States, which made substantial progress in getting lower through the 1980s, has made little progress since then. The gaps between young people from different economic circumstances have stayed the same or gotten worse. So this chart shows changes over time in the gap between whites and African Americans, and the gap in whether they complete high school and whether they complete college. So the black line here is the gap in high school completion. And you can see that from a very large gap of 30 percentage points, so the rate of high school completion was 30 percentage points higher among whites than blacks back in 1970, it's fallen to only about 5 percentage points by 2010. So a very rapid and substantial and meaningful decline in the chances of finishing high school for whites and blacks in the United States. But what's happened to the college completion gap? Well, it stayed level for a period of time, but in recent years it's gotten worse. So the chances of finishing college in the United States for African Americans compared to whites, while throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s it was about 14, 13 percentage points, it's now about 20 percentage points. So it's gotten worse. Now, so since 2000, you can see that the black-white gap has gotten, the high school completion gap has gotten better, but the college completion gap has gotten worse. And this time period here in the 80s and 90s is particularly interesting because it's not surprising that the college completion gap would get worse when the high school completion gap gets better. Because as more and more people graduate high school, the population who are eligible for college becomes more heterogeneous, more mixed. And so it's not surprising that there would be some successes but some failures in completing college. So this time period here in the 70s, 80s, and 90s is particularly interesting because it was a time period, of falling gaps in high school completion, but stable gaps in college completion. So that can be regarded as a big success. But that is a success of the past. Because at the present time, while high school completion continues to improve, gaps in college completion have become worse. Just a couple more slides for test scores. This is performance on the National Assessment of Educational Progress, the NAEP. The same thing that is taken by state samples of students from states all over the United States. Now this time, the two lines represent whites versus African Americans, and that's the dark line at the top. And then differences between young people whose parents went to, whose highest level of education was high school, versus young people whose